as a foundational framework for digital trade. I'd like to begin, as we start this, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community, including the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, where I currently am. We pay our respect to the elders past, present and emergent, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. I would like to also acknowledge the elders from all the lands and language groups across all of our ASEAN member states who are joining us here today as well. And I would like to call out, within that context setting, our colleagues at the ASEAN Secretariat, who I can already see coming in, and in particular, some of the working groups that are a primary motivation for this series of webinars, in which this data sharing webinar today is one of, and that is the ACCSQ, which is the ASEAN Consultative Committee for Standards and Quality, and also Conformance, and the work that they are doing to promote digital trade and digital trade standards now as a key element of the work they're doing. I would also, as we begin, like to call out our colleagues and good partners at the Australian APIC Study Centre at RMIT, the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, particular, as you've already heard, helping us, Kevin Nguyen, Lynn Zakaria and Bonnie Rivendell, all there in Melbourne. And I would like to recognise the funding and sponsorship and support we get from Australian Aid and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, as part of this ongoing ASEAN-Australia Digital Trade Standards Initiative, which encompasses this very strong commitment to this area of work in the partnership between Australia and ASEAN. I'd also, to finalise this, just like to thank my colleagues at what was TRPC, but is now part of Access Partnership, that we've now joined due to a merger between Access Partnership and TRPC this last week. So thank you to Gareth Tan in particular. And with that all out of the way, I'd like to kick into digital trade and in particular digital trade standards. And we have approximately 90 minutes to get through some very in-depth and diverse presentations. And I'm going to call them out in order so that I can introduce the speakers to you. And then I'll briefly cover them again as we go to each person. But in order, if you don't all mind, we have Marcus Bartley-Johns, the Regional Director for Government Affairs and Public Policy at Microsoft. Following Marcus is Bernadine Ferntz, who is Global Head of Infrastructure and Regional Head of Asia Pacific at the Open Contracting Partnership, OCP. And as you've now seen, Aradhana Sharma, Digital and Data Solutions Director at Advance.ai, where she works on solutions for fraud prevention, customer due diligence, and process automation. And I'm calling those out because they've been particular issues that have been getting discussed in the working group at ASEAN. So I'm hoping we can dig in there. And last but absolutely not least, particularly given the initiatives going on in this member state, is Dr. Carl Ng. Dr. Carl is the Director for Data Ecosystem Development at the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation, or MDEC, where he in particular is working to build Malaysia's national data ecosystem. Given the strength of the presentations, I'm doing what I don't usually do in calling all of these individuals out at the start because we have a lot of work to go through. I know that to each of you, my colleague Gareth has given you the generous 8 minutes to talk to. I'm going to call you up well before that, even though I know you've got great material. But we are going to ask for some brief presentations and comments from each of these 4 presenters before opening it up. As we kick off at the outset, I'll remind everyone of the chat box and the limitations of our wonderful digital platforms. Please do participate in the chat at the side because Kevin is absolutely rigid about keeping you silent so that we can hear from the speakers as this progresses. And with all of that out of the way, Marcus, who is the brains at the regional public policy elements and government engagement positions for Microsoft in Southeast Asia or all of Asia, Marcus?
Yeah, all of Asia, but with ASEAN always close to my heart, of course, Peter.
Absolutely. All right. And with that, Marcus, we're in your hands to kick us off. And please.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Access Partnership, TRPC, and the Australian Study Centre for organising the discussion. I think it's a great opportunity as part of this series of discussions about digital trade and standards to jump to the data issues. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. I think where we come from on these issues of data sharing broadly, which I think, you know, this is the global context we're seeing, but I think it's very relevant in ASEAN, is, of course, we're all very clear on the incredible opportunities that are presented by the massive growth in data, in computing power, in applications like AI. But at the same time, we're very realistic about the challenges that exist for organizations, for countries, particularly for smaller developing countries, to harness the full opportunities that are presented. It's been estimated that fewer than 100 companies around the world are collecting more than 50% of the data that's generated by online interactions. And what we see with that is this potential for a data divide to grow even more significant, and for the risk of greater exclusion in the global economy, within our economies and societies. So when we are looking at the opportunities for greater data sharing and collaboration, it's really from that starting point. What can we do as, frankly, one of those large companies? What can we be doing to facilitate more data collaboration and more data sharing? And particularly, what can we do to help share some of our experience and our thinking on the role of policies, the role of regulation of governments, and on the role of standards, the topic that we're focused on today? I just wanted to talk for a couple of minutes about some of the things we're doing, because I think that will give a little bit of context at some of the areas we're focused on. Of course, there have been many organisations around our region, around the world, that have been focused on these open data and data collaboration issues for many years, as has Microsoft as a company. But what we did last year is we wanted to elevate those issues and give them a much clearer focus in our work. So we launched what we've called the Open Data Campaign, which includes some partnerships with institutions like the Open Data Institute, the GovLab at New York University, and others, to try and give a lot more focus to these issues and give a more practical set of contributions to avoiding that risk of the data divide. So a few of the areas of focus and the learnings that we've been taking from that Open Data Campaign work. The first is, we think it's really important to take a principled approach, that you have to start, whether it's as an organisation, as a government, as a regional organisation like ASEAN, to be setting out the principles that are going to govern the effort to share more data, to collaborate more on data, to see, you know, data play a greater role in digital trade. The principles we have thought are important. You know, starting point, of course, data should be as open as possible. You know, we need to start with that as a foundational principle. The data sharing that we do, we think it's important for that to be empowering. How can we be not just sharing data when we enter into new data collaborations, but how can we be thinking about the tools that come with that, the skills, the ability to use applications like AI for when we're entering into new data collaborations. Two other principles, you know, security is foundational. Of course, one of the challenges when we talk about more data sharing, more data collaboration, is some of the concerns about the security connected to that data. And similarly on privacy, you know, another foundational principle. We need to make sure we're sharing data in ways that protects personal privacy. And the fifth principle, which I think has been a really interesting one, and one we've seen as part of the broader shift in how organizations think about these data issues, is the importance of usability. It's not enough to just share data, to just throw it over the fence. We all need to be getting together more to think about, is that usable? You know, is it in formats that others can use? Have we spoken actively with other participants in data collaborations to talk about how we can overcome some of those challenges? And what are some of the tools and practices we can put in place? So that's the kind of starting point we've taken for this work in the Open Data Campaign. We've been doing a number of different things that I'm happy to pick up on more as we go through the discussion. We're looking at specific new data collaboration initiatives that we can stand up around the world. We've been investing more in tools and frameworks and templates, obviously some of the technologies that are important, but also some of the legal tools. And I know we're going to get to this as well, but publishing some of the data use agreements that we've worked on, for example, and making those openly available for others who are looking at some of those challenges from a contracting and a legal perspective. And then the final area that has been really important for us is on the skills side. Again, if we think the starting point for this is how do we overcome that risk of a data divide, clearly skills are such an important part of that, making sure that all sorts of organizations have access to the skills to understand what their data assets are, to understand what kind of value could be generated by collaborating with other organizations on data. So looking at skilling initiatives, we've run a global skilling initiative to train 25 million people globally on digital skills in the last year. And I think that is the kind of scale that's needed if we're going to overcome that divide. So that's a bit of the context of what we've been focusing on at Microsoft. And I really hope that we can pick up more on some of the specifics, and looking forward to learning from others in the discussion.
Thanks, Marcus. In particular, for everyone here, but in particular for our colleagues coming out of the ASEAN working groups, the issue that you're pointing to of usability, how should they be thinking about usability of data?
Look, it's a great question. I don't think there's one single answer, and I think that's kind of the point. I think we need to be sitting down in the different contexts that we're talking about here, and not just looking at the supply side, not just thinking, I've got a whole lot of data, I need to share it. I mean, that is important, of course, and initiatives we've seen in areas like open government data to just get more data into the public domain is a really important starting point. But we need to be looking at the demand side as well. If we want that data to be usable, who is going to use it? What are some of the scenarios? Are we talking to other people about how they're using it? Are we listening to them when they tell us they're having problems in areas like contracting, or that there's no common formats for the data, that there's no interoperability between different systems? So I think it's my learning looking at these issues is that we really do need to be looking not just at the supply side of what data we're putting out into the world, but thinking about how it's going to be used.
Agreed. And just very, very quickly, and I want to come back to it, so I'm just going to put the teaser out there, brief answer, and we'll come back. You mentioned skill sets. Skill sets terribly important. This is obviously a big question across various working groups for ASEAN. Where should they be looking? How big a deal is this as we move from open data and open government and the publishing of data sets, which ASEAN member state governments have been beginning to pick up the pace on and beginning to see some interesting developments on? Where would you be telling them that they could be looking in terms of the skill sets required to really begin to pick up the pace on this?
Look, I mean, I think, Peter, every government official sitting with us here today knows full well the skills challenge that is out there in terms of maximising the opportunities from data in the digital economy. I think some of the things that I've found to be very important and increase the impact for governments working in this area, I think the first is to be talking to the private sector, and to other stakeholders, but particularly to companies. It's within the private sector that a lot of the skill base is now. It's in the private sector where a lot of the innovation is happening. Of course, governments play a critically important role in facilitating that innovation, but it is happening within the private sector. So understanding what are the skills challenges today, but what are they going to be 2, 3, 5 years down the line? So what can we think about as a government to enable through curriculum development, through retraining programs, through investment in skilling and certification initiatives? It has to be an open conversation between government and industry to do that. And I think that, I know we'll come back to it, but the final thing is, it's a big challenge, but you have to start somewhere. And I think there is some really foundational stuff that needs to be done on issues like national curriculum development, but that doesn't mean we need to stop looking at some smaller, quicker measures as well, like having some employees jump online and spend 5 hours doing a course that helps them just ask some of the right questions about what data is, why might it be important for our organisation, and what kind of applications there could be. So you've got to start somewhere.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Bernadine, I'm expecting that that's a terrific segue into what you're going to take us through. So I was hoping that Marcus would tee it up like that. For everyone, Bernadine Ferns is Global Head of Infrastructure and Regional Head of Asia Pacific at the Open Contracting Partnership, and I think you're going to take us into some of the details around that. Bernadine?
Thanks, Peter. Gareth, very quickly, I have a quick slide deck. Should I share that, Gareth, or I know you mentioned that you've got your own.
Bernadine, you can share it. I've set it up so you can share it yourself.
Okay, great. So give me a second. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, we're with
okay,
you.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks so much. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real delight to be here. I'm going to, as Peter said, talk you through some of the work that we do here at the Open Contracting Partnership. I'll give you a quick overview also of our data standards and how that can help us get better outcomes from public spending. So I'm going to start with some context. There's a huge amount of money in public procurement, which is why we do the work that we do. So there's $13 trillion that's spent on public contracts every year all around the world. But we also know that public procurement is government's #1 corruption risk. So numbers from the OECD tell us that almost 60% of foreign bribery cases, for example, involve bribes for public contracts, and 30% of companies in the EU tell us that corruption prevented them from winning contracts. Now, in the ASEAN region, you'll see similar trends. So, for example, in Indonesia, corruption in procurement costs the Indonesian government up to $4 billion every year. And KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission, also tells us that 80% of all corruption cases relate to public procurement. And similarly, a third of companies tell us that gifts are expected in order to secure government contracts. And of course, in the wake of the pandemic, or in the peak of the pandemic, COVID has exacerbated these challenges. We know that crisis situations are ripe for corruption, and that's due to the soaring funding levels, the reduced financial controls, frequently changing of floods of new actors entering the market, all of which have created a kind of a Hunger Games scenario as national governments, local governments, subnational governments, all the public health agencies were all scrambling to purchase the essential equipment, medicines, and services that we need to deal with this pandemic. And as a result, as we've all seen, millions and millions of dollars have been squandered on very questionable purchases. We've seen ventilators that never arrived, for example, in Israel. We've seen counterfeit masks. We've seen test tubes that actually turned out to be nothing more than mini soda bottles that were completely unfit for purpose. And we've also seen a very drastic case of a raspberry farm in Bosnia that scored a $6 million contract to supply ventilators. So it's clear that something needs to be done. And the question is, what can we do about it? Well, this is where open contracting can help. And open contracting has become a global norm. It's endorsed by the G20, it's endorsed by the OECD. We work with the multilaterals like the World Bank, and it's also an open government partnership norm. So we have at the moment just under 200 commitments, OGP commitments and national action plans to open contracting. So it's very much become a tool for completing or satisfying your open government partnership commitments. So the question is, what is open contracting and who is OCP? So the Open Contracting Partnership, or OCP, we work with governments, businesses, civil society, all multi-stakeholders to transform public procurement to deliver better goods, services, and works for everyone. And we do this using the power of open data and effective participatory mechanisms. And the end goal of what we're trying to do is to reduce corruption, to improve competition, to level the playing field, enhance efficiency, create better value for money, and increase public trust. And at the core of our work are two open data standards. That's the Open Contracting Data Standard and the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard. And these help stakeholders to publish and use standardized, structured, machine-readable open data in a timely manner. So it's easier to understand, it's easier to figure out what works and what doesn't, and from there, introduce reforms. So this is an example of the life cycle of one of our data standards, the OCDS, so the Open Contracting Data Standard, and you'll see that it covers the entire value chain of contracting. So all of the contracting processes from start to finish, going from planning and bidding, award, contract implementation. So let's look at a simple example of why data standards are so important. So data standard sets out how to format data, as I said, so that it's standardized and machine readable. But if you look at this date, for example, so this is a date, but is it, like, what does this date tell us? It might mean different things to different people. Is it the 3rd of July or is it the 7th of March? So in the UK, for example, where I'm sitting right now, it would be the 3rd of July, but in the US, it would be the 7th of March. And similarly, then you can look at multiple other different date formats. And it may be difficult enough for us as a human reader to look at this and try and figure out what it means, but it's almost impossible for a machine to do that. So data standard helps to resolve that ambiguity. It helps different systems to work out how to interpret the information. So then you can start to make sense of the data and you can compare like for like. So it makes the data interoperable. So that's our starting point. But what does it mean in reality? It means that you can go from something like this, which is a real example. It's a real photograph from the Ukraine, files and files of procurement data in rooms just like this one. So you can go from something like this to something like this. This is a state-of-the-art open data e-procurement system called Brozora that was built in the Ukraine from our partners there. And in the first year of operation alone, they made over $1 billion in savings just from the efficiency gains alone. In addition to that, we had thousands of new suppliers flood the market and perceptions of corruption also halved. It also means that you can join up different data sets and different systems so that, for example, here, central governments can more effectively monitor local government. Businesses can more efficiently identify upcoming opportunities. And we know that that's one of the biggest barriers for businesses when there are multiple different purchasing platforms at different states, at the federal level, at different states, at the local level. And it's, unless you're a very large company, very difficult for you to be able to monitor all of those and prepare bids. And also civil society can monitor how government is performing. Now, in terms of joining up data sets, you can even push the boundaries of what you do even further. So this is an example from Malaysia, where you can join up procurement data with planning data and also vulnerability data to help identify, in this case, the optimal locations for new schools and hospitals, so that what's being built or what's being procured by the government actually meets the needs. So for the poorest people or where the capacity gaps are, for example. Now, in this example, this is an example from Indonesia. Using standardized data can also help you to develop reusable tools. And in this example, it's to identify corruption risk, for example, where they have a red flags tool that applies open contracting methodologies and red flags indicators. And they also have 3 different dashboards that assess competition, efficiency, public integrity, and value for money using the OCDS use cases and our guidance on what type of indicators you should be capturing. And of course, Indonesia is the first country in Southeast Asia to publish OCDS data. Now, I'm going to close with a very quick example. This is one of my favorite examples of what you can achieve with the open contracting approach. So in Colombia, the open contracting approach helped to expose a price fixing cartel in Bogota, where suppliers in the city of Bogota were colluding to keep prices of school meals high. So chicken drumsticks, for example, were being priced at $20 a piece, which of course is extremely expensive. We wouldn't even pay that here in London. But more importantly, also what had been paid for, so the school meals that had been purchased were not actually being delivered. And when our partners looked into it, they discovered that the reason they could do this was because the procurement process bundled together different things that excluded smaller companies from participating. So, for example, you not only had to provide the fruits, apples, and pears, but you also had to distribute it across the school network. And many of the smaller companies couldn't do this, and they could do only one or the other. And that's why there were only a few companies that were in the field. So as a result of this, they unbundled these contracts so that the smaller companies could play. And as a result of that, we've seen that supply diversity increased by over 350%, costs went down by up to 20%. And more importantly, over 700,000 school meals were delivered to children all over the city. So I'm going to stop there. So hopefully that has given you an idea of what the open contracting approach and model can do. And of course, I've talked a lot about the data standards, and Marcus mentioned the Open Data Institute. They're a huge friend of ours, and we do a lot of this work on data, but obviously data is just the start of the journey, and it's not the end. And there needs to be a whole raft of complementary initiatives and activities, participatory approaches and mechanisms, feedback loops, that we need to bring it all together so that the data is not only published and used, but it actually fits the whole life cycle of reforms to get to those better outcomes, whether it's reduced corruption, improved efficiency, better competition, whatever that we all want, so that we get the better goods, services and works for everyone. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Peter.
That was excellent. Thank you, Bernadine. I was actually going to leave the questions till the end and then begin to mine the questions that were already coming in. But you've set it up so well. If I take it back to that first question, Bernadine, with the question we got of trade data being inherently sensitive, containing various things that are commercially risky, so how do you de-risk that when you've got B2B, B2G and so on? I got the broader question with open contracting of how hard it is to put in place, but this might be an easier place to start. How do you take the data sensitivities on board when you're contracting?
That's a really good question, Peter. And I think there's always this worry, I think, in the work that we do, that when you're publishing data, you're somehow publishing really sensitive information or commercial secrets. But in actual fact, when you look at the public contracting value chain, a lot of this data is actually already in the public domain, because you already have regulations that mandate, for example, that tenders be published, and you need to know, basic information there. You need to know who wins and things like that. So a lot of this data is already actually in the public domain. It's just that it's scattered in multiple different systems, like different notices, newspapers, etc. And it then makes it impossible to make sense of it, because you can't find the data. So there are actually a lot of our partners. I mean, I talked a lot also about what our government partners are doing, but we've also seen lots of our partners in India, for example. Civic Data Lab is one of our partners. They're not in government, they're outside of government. And some of the work that they've been doing in Himachal Pradesh, for example, is really about scraping data that's already in the public domain and putting it on a central platform, and creating some analytics around it so that people can make sense of it. And again, it's in India. There's a lot of data in the public domain, but a lot of it is behind capture. So you have to, basically what that means is you have to enter a code to prove that you're not a robot, right? And so that makes it really time consuming when you've got thousands and thousands of contracts and thousands of contracting processes. So a lot of it is already in the public domain. And we also have a really good guide that I recommend anyone read, and it's called Myth Busting Confidentiality. And that goes through a series of objections that we constantly hear, and how that's overcome, and how actually implementing this open contracting approaches is not as sensitive as one might expect.
I was going to follow up immediately, but I really appreciated Aradna's cat photo bombing up right behind us. She was getting ready to talk. Before we go to Aradna, I want to come at perfect answer. I want to come at the same question from the other direction. The idea of the difficulty idea. You're getting a lot of government agencies to work together, and a number of your examples are pointing to that procurement issue. A number of us having been through the data and the cloud computing journeys, we have run into the challenges of the dispersed agency responsibilities. Procurement tends to sit separately from the folk who believe they have responsibility for data access and provisioning and the infrastructure. Your standards are helping bring the folk together, but they've still got to agree on this. Given those examples you're giving, how difficult is this to get the various agencies to buy in and walk in a straight line?
It's a good question, Peter. And I think the answer is that it depends. So, which isn't a cop-out, I promise. But so first of all, OCP, we have the luxury of working with with reformers who actually want to make a difference and want to make a change. So more often than not, we get government agencies coming to us saying, we're implementing a raft of reforms at the moment. We want to do things better. We want to adhere to international best practice and international standards. How can we do this? Can we help? Can you help us? And that's usually our starting point. But having said that, even when that happens, sometimes you might find the case where you get buy-in at the highest level, for example, but then middle management downwards may not necessarily be bought in. And I've sat across the table in some situations where I've been invited to start implementing this process, and then getting there and the middle managers are completely against it. So there is also the political economy to think about, and the softer side of the work that we do, which is really about advocacy, the materials that and the use cases of the arguments that help to show why this work is beneficial to that stakeholder, right? So it's not just about transparency. It's not just, oh, let's open up because that's the done thing currently, it's popular, whatever. It's really about thinking about what your end goal is and how can we help you to achieve that. So for governments, very often the internal efficiency argument is the most compelling, because we know that things like data collection takes time. We know that that is a huge cost center. So in Buenos Aires, for example, we're about to release an impact story, and governments there, from an assessment that we did, tell us that data collection on one infrastructure project alone, in terms of the procurement data that they're collecting, takes them up to 2 weeks on one project. In the Ministry of Education, they have 239 projects, and that's just to collect the data. And now with an open data platform, that 2-week collection time has radically reduced to 1 day. So that's 93% in cost savings and time savings. So when you start to make those arguments to say that you're not doing this for some kind of altruistic reason, you're really doing this because it helps you. And the more useful the data is to whoever it is who's publishing it, the better the quality is, and then the more data that you get into the public domain. So you try to create this virtuous cycle, if you like.
Is part of the message that you guys in particular take out there the same as the Jenny Craig Weight Watchers thing, or the dentist with the white teeth solution, where you do the before and after picture? You show them the Ukraine office with the books and papers everywhere, and then you show them how it looks when it's digitalized and paperless. Is it the before and after pictures that are working for you?
Yeah, so there are some of those really compelling pictures. There's another that I didn't put into my presentation today, but there's a great photo from Lithuania, and it's basically a room with rows and rows of toilets, and there are no cubicles, no doors, no sinks, and it's a real photograph, and people always laugh because they don't believe me. And so often, I've talked a lot about corruption. It's not always corruption. Very often it's just a lack of coordination, and it's poor instructions coming through because people aren't talking to each other. And the kicker was, on that example, it wasn't even supposed to be a toilet. It was supposed to be a girls' changing room. So somebody had gotten the spec completely wrong. So those types of real world examples really, really do help. And that's why we do make a very conscious effort to follow the story all the way through and quantify the improvements, because that's what people want to see, right? We want to see impacts and we want to see results. And then the final thing I'll say also is that in terms of the difficulty, so this work can be difficult technically, and we talked a little bit earlier when Marcus was talking about capacity and skills. So one of the things that we do at Open Contracting at OCP is that we provide a free technical help desk. So we have a free help desk full of experts, so open data standard experts, data analysts, data scientists, to help implementers through that journey, so that we can get to the end result that we all want.
You need to watch the questions as the others are now speaking, because you're going to get people following up on the positives they need to take from the toilets in the girls' changing rooms without the doors being a good example of data sharing. We're sensitive out here in ASEAN, Bernadine, so I know you're going to get questions on this. Aradna, I'm going to move on to you. We're beginning to run a little behind. I know you're going to take us in a slightly different direction. So Aradna Sharma, who's the Digital and Data Solutions Director, SEA, Southeast Asia, for Advanced.ai, it's over to you.
Thank you. So I'll just give a bit of an introduction about the company. So Advance AI is a leading big data and artificial intelligence company in Asia. So we're geared towards helping to solve digital transformation, fraud prevention, credit risk assessment, process automation, and sharing of alternative data. Now, we collaborate with the public and private sectors across Southeast Asia with focus on certain sectors where the data is rich and of value. So these sectors predominantly being financial services, retail, e-commerce, and insurance. So Advance AI actually has been doing a lot of work in encouraging data sharing between various parties, while of course ensuring compliance to the relevant regulations nationally in all the countries across Southeast Asia, which can be quite challenging because they vary from country to country and can change overnight in some of the countries in Asia. Now, as a data service provider or a data processor, Advance AI performs multiple data services, such as data preparation, data sharing, and data analytics. And really depending on what the needs of the clients are, we're able to service a variety of requirements to not just share data, but to utilize data effectively and build trust while facilitating data exchange amongst the data consumers and data providers. Now, one of the key initiatives we've been working on recently is in collaboration with the government and private sector, being our clients, is to increase financial inclusion in emerging economies like Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. Now, while there is a business push and need, there is a significant data privacy risks obviously involved when we're talking about sharing data amongst, government and private entities. So sharing data safely, securely, and privately is obviously a key area of concern for many, which is why we have a standardized data sharing agreements. I think in Singapore, we're pretty lucky. We've got all sorts of frameworks around data sharing that the government has provided guidelines and best practice, which really assists organisations like ours to help set up these policies and processes to ensure that we are abiding the law, at least locally. Now, one of the key initiatives we implemented to facilitate the adoption of data sharing within an example is financial services sector is we created something called a credit alliance framework. So a credit alliance framework is built on our fintech clients. So fintech is an area that's kind of exploded in the recent past few years. So we're talking e-payment companies, lending companies, neobanks, etc. All transacting online, and hence they need to go through a customer due diligence process as they onboard new customers. Well, when we think about fintechs and the clients they onboard, imagine the kind of data you capture during client due diligence. ID verification, biometrics, address, income details, employment, etc. So, working with a group of fintechs clients and being able to consolidate customer due diligence data, as well as data from our data partner network, which consists of telcos, retails, and e-commerce companies. This allowed us not only to create blacklists, which consist of high-risk customers, but it also allowed us to identify other means of assessing a customer's risk or credit worthiness. It's amazing. Transactions hold a lot of valuable data that offer insights into consumer patterns and needs, as well as credit scores, risk profiles, amongst other intelligence. So analysing shared data by leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning to access data insights helped us to create risk management solutions, which really resulted from organizations being able to share data and for advanced AI to be able to consolidate that data, to slice it and dice it, to assist financial institutions, including large traditional banks, who really have not been able to service this unbanked and underbanked population, which is actually quite a large population when we look at Southeast Asia, because they've never had enough data on these unbanked or underbanked individuals and SMEs. So for these individuals and SMEs, getting any kind of financial assistance was extremely difficult, as their loans would be rejected because there's nothing really to base their credit assessment on. Credit bureaus don't have that data either. So hence this framework and this initiative and this data sharing that we have implemented amongst our clients has actually accelerated financial inclusion in a lot of these countries like the Philippines, where we're actively working with the credit bureaus like CIBI and Indonesia. And we're also currently exploring Thailand and Malaysia. And because this is obviously a key initiative for a lot of these governments, is to increase financial inclusions, which obviously can inject a lot of economic activities. As these people gain financial assistance, they're able to start new businesses, inject innovation in the economy, which also encourages digital trade practices. So this, initiative of ours kind of has turned into a solution which has a lot of demand from our customers, because nobody else really has this kind of data. Now, obviously, the issues, with that is some clients will be very concerned about what kind of data we're sharing with their competitors. So when we talk about data, there's a lot of education that's involved in this as well. So it's really helping clients to understand, as Ben was saying previously, it's not really sensitive data that we're sharing. It's more really the insights that we gain from the consolidated data that we are sharing to solve problems such as assisting the underbanked and unbanked population to gain access to financial assistance, but also having a credit profile, which they wouldn't have had predominantly through a credit bureau. So, that's been quite a successful journey for us so far, and that particular solution has done quite well. So while we do this in Singapore, we also do this in Indonesia. Indonesia, obviously the regulations are very different. You can't take data outside of Indonesia and must remain within Indonesia. So we set up an operation to ensure that we're compliant with the local regulations there, but we're also able to offer such solution within Indonesian fintechs. So yeah, that's it's probably one of the key initiatives that I wanted to talk about.
Thank you very much. I've got multiple questions. I've got 3. You ready for them?
Yes.
Okay. So we were keen to have you guys on because AI and the excitement and interest around AI is one of the key issues people are focusing on when it comes to sponsoring and driving through data sharing. There is a rapidly accelerating realization among governments around the region that this now has to take off because of the sharing of data sets. They get that now, because if they're going to be participating in an AI economy, as they've been trying to participate in data-driven economies and data analytics, they need to understand how to go about this. So AI is a particular driver for them. How prepared are they? Number one. Number two, your examples that I'm going to come back to later on, the financial inclusion example is a terrifically good one, and we're all working in this space. And it's terribly important, as you point out, in our economies in Southeast Asia, which is still the biggest population of the non-included. There's also a lot of nervousness now around the credit rating, credit scoring, credit profiling issues, which you've sort of begun to touch on at that last bit of we're not sharing sensitive data, we're sharing the insights from it. It might be worth just expanding on that one a little bit for that separation. Why is credit scoring and credit rating and credit profiling such a boon to both governments and merchants and populations going forward? How do we de-risk it? Number two. Number three, related to that, is the earlier question in the chat about why would people want to share their data? Why are people voluntarily going to share their data? All three questions in my mind are rather linked, and I think you've been touching on them in what you've been talking, but maybe you can help to, as Bernadine taught us, demythologize some of the FUD in this.
Sure. In terms of your first question, yes, how ready are organizations for artificial intelligence? Look, I think it really depends on the countries. If we're talking about Singapore is ever ready when it can, anything that relates to digital. It is very much a digital nation, and I think they've done a wonderful job in embracing data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, not just within the private sector, but within the government sector. Actually, the government sector in Singapore is a lot more advanced than the private sector, because they have implemented so many different initiatives to really encourage innovation in this space. For example, they created a sandbox where the private sector, technology vendors, and the different government agencies can test different models and different solutions around data sharing or data products or fraud detection technology to trial it within a particular environment with particular data sets. Obviously, as you know, with any kind of artificial intelligence, you need data. You need quality data, rich data, which can become an issue because not everybody is willing to share real data. So it has to be real life data. And I'll give you an example. For example, a couple of years ago, we developed a product that was targeted towards insurance companies. We thought it was very innovative and cool. So it's an app where you take a picture of an image and it analyzes the image. So, you're going to work, you have an accident, your car is damaged, you need to call an insurance company, then you need to get a quote for the cost of the repair. You need to go to 3 different mechanics to get quotes. And if the insurance company doesn't feel that it's a reasonable amount, then they will send the car to one of their own valuers. So it's quite a lengthy process. So we developed a technology where you just take a picture of the damaged car and it will automatically calculate how much the damage is worth. And it will also refer you to the nearest mechanic that you can take it for that price. But it also feeds the data back to the insurance company. So from just taking a picture, you do not need to do anything else. You don't need to fill out a form. You don't need to go to mechanics to get quotes. So it was that simple. But the issue we ran into was to trial it out, to test this out in the real world. So we knocked on various insurance companies' doors and we could not get anybody to agree on sharing real data because these are highly sensitive data of, pictures of cars and customers and, car plate numbers that connects people to individuals, details. So, I guess, how ready are we? That's a good question. In Singapore, I think, we've done a lot better than most countries. But if I look at other countries, these innovative products that we think we're ready for, perhaps, the lack of trust in sharing data does dampen the efforts in accelerating this, digital economy in a lot of ways. So I think there's, two different sides to it, depending on what countries. Philippines, are ready, but they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have access to internet, so they don't have access to digital online services. Because there are 700 different islands in Philippines, so accessibility becomes difficult. So I think different countries has different challenges and the level of readiness. But I think I'm pretty confident saying Singapore is probably the most ready in Asia.
Aradhana, as you demythologize and demystify the issues around data use and usability and the importance of trust, have you been surveilling and stalking me today?
I can't say I have.
I'm just wondering why you're reaching for the car example that I know. I've heard about it before.
Had an accident.
Well, as I'm watching my phone just explode because my wife totaled my car 4 hours ago, and I'm watching this stuff just coming at me, and you've got the solution. It was just a picture that she refuses to take and send to me because I know she screwed up here. I'm just wondering why that example was the one that you landed on.
There we go.
Anyway.
Artificial intelligence, remember, that's what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. The other bit before, as I segue, and I'm going to come back to you on the other parts of the question. It was a great answer, and I'm going to give both you and Bernadine a chance to scroll down the essay in the side chat there, because I know Bernadine's going to want to come back to this. But of course, as you talk at the merits of the various member states all around us, you of course are also saying the other great progressive state in this is Malaysia, right? With its absolute readiness, with all the work that's been going on, which allows me to segue to Dr. Karl.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think Malaysia is up there. Yeah, probably our closest competitor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So with that, and knowing that we're going to come back to some of these issues, I do want to move across to Dr. Karl,
Sure.
who's the Director for Data Ecosystem Development at MDEC, the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation that many of us know and love and have worked with extensively. Dr. Karl, it's over to you. You're on mute. You just need to unmute. Still on unmute.
In the top right, Dr. Karl, there should be a little microphone icon.
Let's see if we can help.
We still can't hear you at the moment.
How's your sign language skills? Yeah, that was pretty good. We're getting that. All right. Kevin, are you able to help unmute?
I unfortunately can't unmute him.
The most famous phrase. Yes, it is. Okay, Dr. Karl, I'm going to suggest that you might just want to try quickly rebooting, and I'm going to vamp with Bernadine answering the essay in the side chat for 2 minutes. It might just help, because often what happens is the platforms, we are using Teams, right?
We are on Teams.
And yet it's seamless. Teams always work. So I'm not sure. This is usually one of the other platforms having a problem like this. Dr. Karl, do you want to try just rebooting the computer and coming back? That wasn't sign language.
I think he gave the thumbs.
I think he did too. While Dr. Karl reboots, Bernadine, I did want to come back, which is why I gave you a bit of a flag. They've asked a question almost spot on the areas that you're talking about. And I thought you might just want to address this just very quickly of the progress around fraud and issues.
Sorry, I couldn't, you broke up there a little bit, Peter. What was that, the coordination around?
The question you'll see in the side there, it's a very long question, but it's picking up on your issue about auditing and corruption and these fears. And there is a lot of issue that as we go through the pandemic, it's increasing. How do we address this? How worried are governments? How much is this going to progress? How important is it that things like open contracting address this?
Thanks, Peter. So I think that's an important question, and it's obviously an important issue. And I think increasingly governments all around the world are starting to pay attention to this. I think there's two things, right? So I think one is the acknowledgement that this is a problem, and it's widely accepted that government spending has a lot of leakage, and there's any number of research papers and etc. that confirm this. So we are seeing that increasingly governments, both national and subnational governments, are paying attention to this. And we're also seeing that there's increasingly a more mobilized civil society that's also looking to participate in this process and hold the decision makers to account. So where the data comes in, I think there's a lot of usefulness for where we can use open data to do this. So one of the examples that I showed in my slides was an example from Indonesia. So we have, for the Open Contracting Data Standards, so the OCDS, we have various use cases that I talked about before, and one of which is helping to reduce corruption. And we also have in that guidance how to calculate different indicators that might help to flag risk of corruption. So this is what we call our red flags methodology. So if you use standardized data, you can, depending on what data you have, create indicators or create flags that give you an alert if something suspicious is happening. And the different ways of doing this. In Indonesia, for example, they use it to calculate scores. So they've created an index so that you can see whether a certain contracting process is high risk or low risk, depending on certain parameters. And actually, even in Malaysia, several years ago, we worked with the government there on a tool called Cartology, which also was a red flags tool to help to identify corruption risk at the earliest stages. And what's interesting about that was that it was designed to be used before the contracts are awarded, so that it's preventative rather than just reactive. So I think very often in the corruption narrative, it's retrospective. So people look at the data and they're able to identify where corruption has happened in the past. And that's almost too late, because the problem has happened. It's very rare to recover the funds that are lost. Whereas if you catch it up front, then you prevent it from happening. And the idea with the Malaysian government at the time, the Harapan government, but I believe that they're still working on the tool now internally with MOF, was that every time you're about to award a contract, you need to run the tool to check what the risks for corruption was. And obviously, it's just an indicator for further investigation. I think we need to also be careful about what data can do for you, right? So there's some things where you might be able to throw up red flags so that you can investigate and understand more whether something is going wrong or not, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that something is going wrong. So I think those are different ways in which the data can help you to identify whether something is going wrong or right. And then in terms of the second part of the question of what happens once that wrongdoing has been identified, I think the data is also really helpful as your evidence base to verify, the extent of what has happened, the extent of the losses, and then that can also have some bearing on, what the penalties might be.
Yeah, very good answer. Actually, if we've got time at the end, I want to come back to both you and Marcus digging into the by design aspects, both in terms of data sharing and the security issues, because I think that's really worth giving some thought to. But Dr. Carl, I can see and unmute it. I can very clearly.
Right.
So we're going to hand straight over to you.
Okay. Next. Right. So we're talking a bit about the data ecosystem in Malaysia, how we have progressed throughout the years. Just a bit of a background. Who is MDAC? MDAC, it's a government agency under the Ministry of Communication and Multimedia. Our role is to accelerate towards the digital economy for Malaysia, and we do that by looking at three broad areas. One is looking at skills, digitally skills. Second, it's making sure that businesses are equipped when it comes to digital adoption. And lastly, on the digital investment, to encourage more companies to invest. Next. So this is what we focus on, and we believe that we are the heart of digital ASEAN, and our role is to lead the digital economy forward for all Malaysians, right? So Malaysian students, professionals, businesses, as well as large-scale investments. Next. Data has been one of the areas that I've been working on in the last 7 years, and we started our journey by looking at big data analytics. I developed the National Big Data Analytics Framework, and subsequently that led to some work, quite a number of initiatives around building that capacity when it comes to big data analytics. And then it moved into AI. We have developed a framework around that as well. And right now there's a AI roadmap that's being developed. While we're developing this, we realized that we cannot take an ad hoc approach when it comes to developing the ecosystem. It has to be done in a structured approach, right? Through our experience, we believe that companies go through their journey. We start with literacy, and then they start to look into governance, data analytics. And with that, with more data, they need to look at data governance, and data sharing only comes, later part, when you have the infrastructure in place, that you have the right talent in place. Then you start to look at more data sets to look at getting more insights. And with that, then we move into AI, right? We believe that the structured approach looks at 4 different areas, which is KITA. Kita in Malay language means our. It's our data, right? So K for knowledge. I agree with all of you. There's need to look at promoting data awareness, data literacy among the businesses, the people, and the citizen as well. Next is the infrastructure. This is why we need to build an environment, the governance, the policy, and also to attract the right investments in terms of infrastructure to make things work. Talent is a big area that we need to make sure that we have the talent that understand data, making use of the data, right up from the top level to the all employees within the organization. And action is where it's key, right? Use cases, right? So when we talk about use cases, it's not just from organization standpoint, but also pilot initiative that people can actually relate to, right? So those are the things that we focus on. Next. Okay, let me just go through some of the examples in data sharing initiative in Malaysia, right? Like all countries, we have an active Department of Statistics that publish a lot of data. A lot of primary data, secondary data can be obtained through this. We also have geospatial data sharing as well, where people can share the data. It's available. And about seven years ago, we started the data.gov.my. I play a key role here, where we have a collaboration with Open Data Institute. We train up all the government employees. We call them data champions within the ministry, and then they go back and make sure that this gets implemented within the organization. So the data.gov.my, the number of data has improved significantly. There's a policy directive related to this in the government. Right now, I think they have tens of thousands of data within the organization. At the same time, more recently, the government is looking at a government-wide data sharing platform. It's still it has started a couple of years ago, and right now they have ministries and agencies looking into this. Still very much in the pilot stage. It's not open to the private sector yet, right? So it's mainly on the government perspective, right? Next. And more recently, there's a need to look at data sharing as in the government as a whole. right? So what has happened in 2 years ago, there's a data sharing task force that was created by our Ministry of Communication and Multimedia. And the focus is to create a policy that everyone can embrace and then serve as a guideline to any organizations and government agency who wants to look at data sharing. So I chair that task force. We've been working on this in the last 1.5 years, and we have produced that document, which is in the process of being approved by the government right now, right? So the data sharing policy is there. At the same time, as part and parcel of work around the ecosystem development, we have been encouraging organizations and companies to come up with their own data sharing initiative with their data platform, for example. And one of it is TM R&D. They have this platform called the Open Innovation Platform. Essentially, it's an API platform that allows people to share their data, and we have been collaborating with them, looking at getting more companies to share the data through this platform. This is apart from I mean, open data can do certain things, but of course, if you want to share data within organization, you need to have a platform, and this is something that we support. And more recently, we have partnered with Toyota Mobility Foundation together with the City Hall of Kuala Lumpur to look at a global challenge where we make city data available for innovation. And through this challenge, we have invited startups around the world. And more recently, 6 startups were selected for the final, and they have used the data to implement minimum viable products in the city of KL. It's quite amazing because right now with the COVID pandemic, work still carry on. There are startups in the US that did the pilot in Malaysia, but making use of local partners to implement those solutions, right? So this is something that we are proud of, and we currently is in the final stage. Next slides. There are some questions around. I saw around that the chat, asking the questions around, why would people want to share data, right? This is an example of a community initiative in Malaysia, but with global impact. These 2 data scientists. One of it is my ex-staff. His name is Hafiz, and another one of my friends is called Dr. Lau, who championed this initiative, right? So when the pandemic started, there's a lot of multiple data around the world. It seems confusing. There's lack of information, and what they did was they mobilized volunteers, 500 to 600 people around the world. These are people that has great data expertise, programming language, and some of them do not even have much. What they do is they mobilize them and give them tasks to develop a portal that allows data sharing, and this display, verified data when it comes to the number of cases, right? So this is one example in terms of what data sharing can do, and if everyone put their heads together, you can actually reap the benefit of it, not just for the local community but the global community as well. Right. So so that's all that I have, and I would like to share as well. What are the current challenges that we face when it comes to data sharing in Malaysia? We have done quite a number of studies as part and parcel of our policy development, and one of the areas that we feel that needs to be addressed, I think, which echoes some of what the other panelists has spoken, is that number one is the awareness, right? So there's lack of awareness when it comes to data rights, to the data subjects, as well as the benefits of data sharing. People are continuously asking, why should I share the data, right? But most people do not realize that, data sharing is already happening. So that is why we have, the largest company around the world owning 50% of the data. We are sharing the data with Google, Facebook, and whatnot to get free services from them, right? So that is what we have opt-in for, right? So that's what's already happening, but not many people are aware of this. That's number one. Number two is clarity when it comes to data sharing and expectation around data trust, data ethics, and the data governance perspective. There's lack of information about how the data is being governed. So the clarity of this is critical. Number 3 is related to talent, right? So they need to make sure that we have the right talent to support this, the data sharing, not just the analytics side, but also the sharing side of things, right? Number 4, it's the technology and infrastructure. While there are data sharing happening within government or within private sector, using Excel files, and that sort of exchange. But to do this at scale, we need to make sure that we have the right technology and infrastructure as well, right? And lastly, it's all about trust, right? So how do you create an environment of trust that allows everyone to share and to maintain the security and to make sure that data is being handled ethically as well. Right. So those are the things that we found, and I'd like to share it with the rest.
Thank you. That's wonderful and a nice in-depth analysis of one of the member states. I want to start now with the question I was going to finish to you and the other contestants, Dr. Carl, the point that you've raised about the data policy. So that you've got Malaysia getting ready to come out with a data sharing policy. My question, as I was going to round it out, was going to be, what do we think the policy initiatives that member states and other governments should be looking to promote and advance data sharing? But it looks like you've already got the answer. Can you give us a sneak preview?
Maybe some of it, because it's not been approved yet. So it's still
the safe stuff, just the safe parts.
Right. Yeah. So number one, I think I just want to point out what Marcus has mentioned. The need to focus on principles. That's number one. Why are we doing this, right? So I think one of the key thing is you need to dispel the notion that sharing of data is wrong, right? Number one is you need to make sure that people understand that by sharing, it creates additional value, right? So that's one of the key principles that is required. There are other principles as well, related to, let me see, the need to look at, ethical use of the data, right?
Yep.
Right, and the governance requirement, as well as the need to look at skills and tools, right? So those are the things that are quite critical, and also I think I mentioned about the pillars that I mentioned earlier on, the data kita.
Yep.
The strategy when it comes to the implementation should address those kind of pillars.
Okay.
Right?
That's very good.
Yeah, and to have I think what the rest has mentioned, it's critical. They need to have data standards. They need to have standardized agreements. They need to look at templates. They need to look at skills development at all different levels. And also the ecosystem development as well, right? Because for this to thrive, you need to have more advanced.ai, right? Startups to come up with innovation, right? And also you need to make sure that the public sectors are also aware of the opportunities when it comes to the data, as well as the community practices as well. Right, so all of this stakeholder needs to come hand in hand, and obviously there's a lot of methods, to be able to get people together, hackathons and community engagements and what sort of things. They need to have a lot more of this kind of activities to make sure that people understand the benefits of data sharing.
So let me pick up on those, because that's terrific, and thank you for giving us the sharing to the data sharing policy that's coming out. But I want to see if the other contestants want to throw any other policy initiatives that they think governments, particularly around our region, should be focused on. But as you're thinking about that, and any of you want to chime in, please do. Marcus, why are we still debating the benefits of data sharing as we are? Because you've all mentioned it, and it's obviously out there. When what has to be the moonshot of our generation, the vaccine for COVID coming out in a year from when it was the virus was discovered and sequenced, unheard of that people could get together and the communities could band together, scientists could get incentivized to address this, and within a year we've got vaccines coming out. Doesn't this show the benefits of data sharing and collaboration? Don't we have this generation's moonshot showing what the benefits of data sharing are?
Yes, I mean, I think if there's any benefits from all of the horrible events of the last year or so, I think it's showing the opportunities when there is that kind of collaboration. I think the other area we've seen it in, Peter, is on some of the tracking, just the ability to pull all sorts of different data sources, to have that shared rapidly across the world, to have that ability to track the spread of the virus, to have more targeted measures, to reduce the severity of lockdowns on the economy and on people's livelihoods. I agree. I think we've got to be able to learn from that, because I think the broad challenge here is, I actually think there is widespread acknowledgement, particularly from governments, about the importance of data sharing and collaboration, and we're seeing more and more policies like the ones that Dr. Carl was talking about. I think there's still probably not enough proof points. I think there's not enough case studies out there that have been openly shared to demonstrate some of the benefits. So just building on that more, showing the practical impact, I think is an ongoing piece of work, and that's going to underline the value.
Yeah, wonderful point. Bernardine, Aradhana, in terms, this is meant to be about data sharing, but also the standards that go with data sharing. You've actually both called out specific standards. We've got ASEAN Secretariat and ASEAN member state colleagues with us who are focused on standards, and they get very interested in which standards they're supposed to focus on, but more particularly how that standardization process occurs. And one of the things that's been a real challenge is, as the world has grown in this data work-driven economies that we're in now, that they've had to move away from the old diehards and friends of ISO and IEC and ITU setting a few standards. We have other bodies setting very important core standards now that they have to learn how to work with. How does the standards in these areas getting set? How are they getting accepted and adopted? And that day-long training program, I need it in 2 minutes.
I can start, and then I'll hand over to you, Aradhana. So we do a lot of work actually with international standard setting organizations. So as I mentioned earlier, we work a lot with the G20, with the OECD. We haven't done much with ASEAN, but we would absolutely love to. So I think the key thing about these data standards is that it makes life easier, right? So it's really about a publication policy. And in terms of the benefit of it, it's relatively light to implement, right? Because it's a data format. So it's not about, you don't have to go through, like with the ISOs, for example, reams and reams of paperwork, to go through that whole process. But it's very much a collaborative process where we can help all the different institutions to publish data in a standardized, machine-readable, interoperable format. So I think that's the key thing. And working with the G20 and the OECD, the multilaterals, etc., many of these institutions have come out to deliver guidance that recommend these open data standards. And to be fair, at OCP, we worked with the OCDS and the OC4IDS, and we think that these are great for very, very many reasons, right? But we're also agnostic about what people want to do with open data. It doesn't have to be the OCDS. If it's any other open data format, if that works for you and the goal that you want to achieve, that's perfectly fine. But the key is that it should be in an open data format so that it can be used in a meaningful way. It can be reused. You can build tools off it, right? And I think the problem is very often you get publishers who publish in kind of flat formats, like in PDFs, or that's not usable to anybody. So when we work with these institutions, in terms of policy, what we recommend in terms of what they endorse or what they promote is mainly 3 things. That one, develop the policy to mandate that data is published in a standardized, structured, machine-readable, open data format. That's key. And I think that's one of the big things, because a lot of agencies do want to publish data, and very often they don't, because they're not sure if it's allowed, because there's not enough clarity on what can be published and etc. So we need clarity on that. We need a mandate to say publish open data, what to publish and how to publish it. The second thing is also publishing is not enough, right? So all our policy guidance, including with the OECD, recently they published the OECD recommendations on infrastructure governance, and that has really clear language and open data and what you need to do on it. But what we also recommend, in addition to publishing data, is that you make a commitment to use that data, because data on itself is meaningless if it's not used. And finally, to work together through participatory mechanisms with multi-stakeholders to transform your local context. So to introduce those reforms to get to the reduced corruption, the improved efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the three things that are must-haves in policy. So it's publish, use, and transform. And with that, you can start to get meaningful reforms. And I think for the folks at the ASEAN Secretariat, it's really important to also be the leader in the region, to set the tone for all the different actors in the region, to say that this is something that is important, this is something that will help the region and put us, on that same international level as others.
This isn't a short strategy, this is a put strategy. Publish, use, transform, the put strategy, yes?
Yes, the publish, use, transform.
Got it. Okay, Aradhna.
So first, individual governments, I think, need to create a safe, seamless and efficient ecosystem for data sharing. So we can have all the policies and procedures and framework, but, without a real ecosystem to be able to share this data nationally, but also cross-border, it makes it quite difficult. They can do so by addressing sort of three critical aspects, I think. Designing regulations to ease data flow. For example, regulators could be by default digital themselves, sort of asking, well, why not, as opposed to why. So they could start by mandating that all aggregated and anonymized public sector data, as well as any data driven from the same, to be open data, to multiply the data generated and improve access for all. Look, this is being, quickly adopted by many countries around the world, including UK, Denmark, Estonia, New Zealand, also Australia and Singapore. And, protecting the whole personal privacy issue, there should be a clear national personal data protection act that builds consumer and business confidence. And I think the lack of confidence or trust, particularly from consumers, sharing data with businesses is also an issue, but then businesses sharing data amongst themselves is also an issue, because there's this lack of trust. Well, what is somebody going to do with my data? Now, in order to build this confidence, this may evolve over time based on, citizen feedback. So, for example, Singapore solicited public opinion while drafting its data protection laws. India also did the same. So, sort of these frameworks are really kind of built around consensus. It's getting public opinion, it's involving businesses. So at least they feel, well, actually their concerns are being addressed, or at least they're being heard. And sharing role model data for societal benefits. I think sometimes you have to weigh the risk, over the benefit. If there's a greater benefit in less risk, then I think, we kind of have to willing to embrace what the overall benefit is going to be. An example for that would be is when I first moved to Singapore, I had a very different perception about Singapore. you know, the government has access to pretty much every single data that is available anywhere I transact, I buy movie tickets, anything that I do, credit card usage, government has every single data that is available on me, which made me very uncomfortable initially. But as I've lived here for almost 5 years, I have to say it's one of the most safest countries I've ever lived in, where I can walk the streets at 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. and it doesn't make a difference, where I never have to watch over my shoulders. So, you know, sort of weighing the data privacy issue over the actual benefit. So, I mean, I'm a complete convert. Now, I'm happy to share any kind of data that government wants, as long as I can live in a very safe society. So I think those things sort of need to be considered when developing these policies, but also sort of sharing the benefit with the greater public, so that they are aware of what is in it for them to be able to share this data. So this sharing role model that I'm talking about, you know, this is has been done sort of the innovation in the public and private sectors in a couple of different countries, US, India, and also Europe. So, I mean, several cities and countries have actually made huge strides towards this direction and realized immediate benefits. For example, Mexico City, you know, received an award at the Data for Climate Action Change for using open data to develop solutions that reduce and eliminate air pollution. Cambodia built a malaria information system to effectively enable data sharing and response coordination between national control programs, research institutions, and various commercial civil society organizations. So while, you know, I think these standards are actually being developed and implemented in countries, there really isn't a standard that countries follow that is fit for purpose for every sector. You know, because within each country, within each jurisdiction, we have different sectors that require different level of risk assessment. For example, financial sector, you know, there's a different standard for that when it comes to data sharing. If it's an e-commerce, there's another different risk element to it. So I think it can get quite confusing when you have all these different frameworks and policies and standards in place, like OS, and then your local standards. It would be wonderful if there was just one for Asia and one for Europe and one for the US countries. But look, I do think it will happen in the future as data sharing becomes easier and the norm. I think the countries will finally consolidate. And I think the key thing is consent. At the end of the day, all of these policies and all of these standards mandate that you get consent for sharing data.
Just to quickly wrap up, because we're about to run over time, in the very final minute, and I thank you all, and I'll come back to that, but maybe just to close this out, because you've sold me. I'm sold. Aradna's just told me I've got to give all of my data to the government so that my life will be safe and worthwhile. What therefore, if we know that's where we're headed, what's the one single challenge that you would like to make sure people are aware of, in particular governments should be conscious of? Single word or single sentence, what's the one challenge that you would leave people focused on? I'm going to go back around my screen, starting with you, Dr. Carl.
Governance, I think that's one of the challenges that we need to look at. How do you govern the data and make sure that's used ethically and creating a trust process in the same time.
Very good. Aradna, single challenge.
Trust. I think there is a very key element when we talk about solving this data sharing resistance is trust, ultimately.
Bernadine.
So So I think the key challenge is actually making a start. I think very often people strive for perfection and then they lose sight of the journey. And many don't start this data sharing journey because they think, oh, we don't have that much data, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the skills, we don't have any number of things. But it's not absolute, right? You can always make a start somewhere. And you can have an iterative process to continuously improve. And similarly, the data standards that we use and the work that we've done in the data standard is permissive. So you don't have to make a change and transform everything all at once and publish everything all at once, but make a start, and then over time, you can incrementally improve.
Marcus, final word to you, one of our trusted digital platform friends who owns 50% of all of our data that we're now happy to share. What's the single biggest challenge that governments and businesses around the region should be conscious of?
Look, I mean, this is the easy answer, but I do agree with what everyone said. And despite your comment, Peter, I think trust is essential. But I think just what I wanted to emphasize, especially in this group, it's the international dimension. And I think we touched on that a little bit in the discussion today, but think outside borders, think outside organizational boundaries. Your COVID example is a great one, Peter. We've only really been able to unlock the full potential through data sharing when we're doing it on a global basis. So let's not be locked within our own national borders when we think about the opportunities here.
And that really is the magic of the standards approach rather than just a regulation approach, isn't it? That's what gets us there when we start looking beyond borders and to true collaboration. I'd like to thank everybody. Your time has been wonderful. I was impressed that one of our architects regionally, Yao Singh, was throwing all his questions at you in the chat. So you've obviously stirred up some interest. If I could thank Dr. Carl Ng, Ms. Aradhana Shana, Ms. Bernadine Fent, and Mr. Marcus Bartley-John. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to CFAT and to the ASEAN Secretariat and the ASEAN-Australia Data Digital Trust Initiative that's sponsoring these webinars. So with that, I will end it all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thanks,
Peter.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.